Again, young Nova, I see that your training is doing well, and that's good, because you never know when, say, a war between baselines and Novas will get started. Oh wait, I probably shouldn't have said that. Spoilers, pay no attention. Anyway, so, what I was going to say, though, is that, fundamentally, if you can't trust Project Utopia, who can you trust? Well, probably not a shady government organization, but maybe they have a point. In this world of superpowered individuals, where the world is decided by the fate of those blessed with powers beyond moral comprehension, who stands up for the little guy? And when the little guy is all of humanity, you're gonna need more than some random guy in spandex. You need, well, in this case, the Directive. The Directive is not it's very much a subsidiary. What I mean by that is Project Utopia technically works for the UN, but basically runs at half the time, and the Terrigen is their own thing, but the Directive is not an independent organization. It strictly works under several governments, and I don't mean the loose way that Project Utopia does. I mean they're straight up funded and directly part of certain governments. This has upsides and downsides, but we'll get into that. Fundamentally, though, I must state something here. The Directive is an operation. It's an organization, but it does not really have its own ideology. Now, granted, the members do have their opinions, but I'm going to discuss it. When I say the Directive, I must acknowledge it to you that I'm often referring to more accurately the government/people of the nations that make it up. Now, that's an important detail to remember. They are people doing a job, not always the people making the policies. This is an important distinction between certain groups. However, I will continue to call them the Directive to be convenient. So, better question, how did the Directive get started? Well, it actually started in Russia. You see, after a while, they became suspicious of Project Utopia. They heard rumors, whispers, and there was always a bit of distrust around Novas. But also if one controlled all the Novas, like Project Utopia is trying to, even if they didn't have malicious intent, it's still a dangerous amount of power for them to have. And also the fact is, Novas are dangerous to some extent. They're given with great powers. They can burn whole cities to death if they're strong enough. And this is before they learned about taint. But ultimately, so that made Russia get worried. However, Russia was also worried of the control Project Utopia was giving. They were restructuring the world, designing it in the way they wanted to. And Russia wasn't exactly interested in that. So they sought allies. Although difficult, since the break apart of their little federation in the East, they did have some strange allies in places. Their first ally was England, which may sound weird, but England was, though left Europe when they became more centralized. England, however, realized that it couldn't be isolationist and needed an ally. Russia, on the Directive, proved to be effective. Japan was in a similar position. Their economy crashed harder than a lead balloon, and they were suspicious of Project Utopia to varying degrees, although also enamored with them. There's a running trend. And surprisingly, they were able to recruit the United States. They thought there was no way they would ever join them, and sent their application more of a formality. But the American government was very interested, and they joined up wholeheartedly, although they did partially end up taking over the show. And that was the original 4 members of the Directive: Russia, England, Japan, and America. They would eventually, and relatively recently, be joined by Germany in a pseudo-coup. However, Germany is not a founding member, and is still on a bit of a probationary period, as it is new and just kind of got over a coup. Ultimately, that is the origin of the Directive, but what's its mission statement? Well, to protect humanity, or baselines, but also Novas. Fundamentally, the Directive nations, well, let's get into that. Fundamentally, the nations that make up the Directive, as a rough analogy, want to protect the rights and services of humanity. They have certain tenets that must be upheld. They have rights to opinions, to life, to reproduction. These are things that are natural and should be given to all humans. And they are partially worried Novas will take it away. So they are ready to defend against them. They don't live in naivety that Novas are just all going to be goody two-shoes, so they're prepared to fight whenever possible, whether Novas or Nova sympathizers. However, this isn't always Nova hate. That's a very important distinction to make. This is a bit of a rough detail, and though there are plenty of anti-Nova sentiments within the Directive, it doesn't really make up the organization. In fact, they generally try to view Novas as what you give a human, you give to a Nova. This is part of their philosophy that actually sets them apart from other factions. We'll get into that. Fundamentally, though, they are part of those 5 nations I mentioned, so they have difficulty dealing with things outside of those nations, which has created several problems, as in if they get a threat somewhere, they have a bigger problem dealing with it falls outside their borders. Not that they aren't willing on some level to go over there and deal with it, it just creates messes they don't like. Ultimately, the Directive is an organization, however, a somewhat fractured one. They all operate under cells. These cells fundamentally do a very particular job, and really no one outside has the best idea of what goes on in a cell beyond people in the cell. Transport cells deliver goods, but don't usually know who they're giving it to. Research and development cells know what technology they're making, but not always who they're giving it to. And of course, cells that deal with problems, aka capturing Novas, don't always know where they're getting the orders from exactly. This needs a conflict, a constant and careful measuring of certain devices and certain security systems to make sure that they don't take giving orders from people that they, shouldn't be getting orders from. This is complex, but ultimately in a world where people have powers to read minds or force information out of people or just get extra sensory perception, it becomes a necessity. This does make it so that the cells do sometimes run into each other in problems, but they can usually sort this out. Usually. However, you don't just sign up for the Directive. This isn't like Project Utopia where you go through a funny process and you get a little training, or Terrigen where you can just say you're part of them. No, to be part of the Directive, they come to you. You don't join them, they come for you. They will search you for months to make sure you are perfectly loyal to their cause to help root out double agents. And then they recruit you in thinking that you'll join a government organization that you have some trust in, or something like that. They'll say that, we're working for the US government, or the Russian government, or whatever government the person they were trusted. And so they'll send them in, and for months they'll train under that, thinking they're working for someone else. This will be another set of tests, but also to train them for what they have to do. Ultimately, after some tests, if they still pass and show no signs of disloyalty, they'll be told the Directive and let in. However, the Directive is not a fully secret organization, as in the nations part of it are fully open about the fact they work at first for part of the Directive. There isn't a lie saying, the Directive doesn't exist. I mean, they probably wish they could go about like that, but the Directive is a publicly known thing. Its inner workings, not so much, but that's just governments for you. But ultimately, their job is much like you suspect a normal thing would work, as they are part of a government. They don't like to run around in bright-colored spandex. They operate in cover uniforms or bulletproof armor. And speaking of their gear is quite fascinating, truly. As since most of them, I say most, are baselines, they naturally have a disadvantage. So they develop technology to try to even the score. Ways to damage the R-node temporarily, bind their opponent in glue, and other such methods. Or, if all else fails, bullets always sometimes work. So, always can rely on that, hopefully. But finding a Nova is a nightmare. Not to mention, it is a bit of a struggle knowing when to attack. I mean, sure, you don't want to attack someone before they've done anything, but you don't want them to, kill a whole bunch of people. And with Novas, that's a fine line. Ultimately, the Directive is sometimes called by some as a anti-Nova organization, which isn't perfectly true, but it's also not a humanitarian organization meant to go out and help save the world. They fundamentally look out for their own nations. If all the other places in the world sunk to the bottom of the ocean, but their 5 member nations were safe, they'd probably be relatively okay with that. I say relatively because they do want to look out for humanity. It's just, someone's gotta come first, and it's gonna be them, or their nations, or the bosses, technically. And ultimately, there is some of the thing about the Directive is, though I've described them in a very efficient manner, unlike Project Utopia, there's still some corruption in their ranks. They're a government organization. If I have to tell you there's some corruption in their ranks, I guess you're really dumber than I thought. But ultimately, They aren't completely corrupt, and they have decent enough intentions. They want to protect the rights of humanity, and most are willing to make concessions to Novas or even think them as humans. Heck, the Directive is more than willing to use Novas, although they prefer, ones with more subtle powers. If for no reason, they're easier to, not explode a block. However, they do not accept taint in any fashion. In fact, it's not exactly known why the Directive hides taint as much as they do. They don't deny that taint exists fully, but they also don't like to give the people all the information about it. It's highly suspected, in my opinion at least, that they do this to keep people from panicking. If they knew that every Nova was just a little bad day, a few bad days away from becoming a horrifying monster, the world would panic. And that's not something you want. Hurts tax season, Ultimately, the Directive is opposed to Project Utopia. They don't know about all the super dark things Project Utopia has done, like the Proteus Protocol, but they have hints and they're worried. And ultimately, they don't trust Project Utopia. They see it as a globalist organization that plans to take them over. They aren't entirely wrong, they are entirely right. And they're far too ignorant of the true threat. And of course, the Directive is opposed to the Terrigen movement, which is, of course, Terrigen is a bunch of Nova supremacists, they're a bunch of pro-humanity or baselines, so naturally the two clash. However, a careful examination of their actual goals would find more similarities than they're okay with. Little things that add up, their own personal motives, seem to align half the time. Both technically fight for personal freedom, although with some major differences. It's almost a bit worrying that the Directive, a group sent to protect the nations, to save their people, is ideologically way more close to a group of Nova supremacists than they like to admit. And what would happen if the Directive were to realize how similar the two really were? Is perhaps this the destiny of all mankind? Or perhaps the greatest betrayal of mankind? Will the Directive, a organization supposedly to help save humanity, lead to its destruction? Whether by truly starting a Nova human war, or perhaps even more terrifying, joining what's supposed to be their mortal enemy in a completely logical plan. Ultimately, that's stuff for the future to decide. But I hope you enjoyed this talk. The Directive is by far a shady organization in its own right, although perhaps it's a bit more honest. It doesn't lie and say it's not shady, although it does lie to itself on occasion. Ultimately, what becomes of that is for your own to decide and to see the future. But ultimately, I will leave now. For next time, we shall discuss the ultimate in Nova supremacy, Terrigen. Yeah? Hey, why don't you hit that sub button? You're gonna become a subscriber. Get to see my content quicker. Wouldn't that be nice? I bet so.